Well, thanks so much for joining us. And first of all, let me say Happy Earth Day. This is Wade Crowfoot, our Secretary of Natural Resources here in California. We'll be getting going in just a moment, so do appreciate you joining. All right. Well, thanks once again for joining and welcome to this Earth Day event. We are very excited the first Earth Day in our country to provide their perspective in California and our country. But of course, the coronavirus pandemic and everybody in state government, we all have keeping our work move forward, joining us. Introduce our speakers, but I first want to on this day, given on our brief slideshow. So this is the New York 50 years ago, photo of Fifth Avenue in New York City. Estimated upwards of 20 million Americans came together to mark this first Earth Day. Interestingly, very much of a grassroots effort to observe a day across the country to recognize the importance of protecting the Earth. Think about this, upwards of 20 million Americans, about 10% of the population, joined in Earth Day events. This was, of course, before the internet, before social media, before email, I think even before answering machines. Ultimately, really depended on the grassroots movement that had coalesced in the 1960s. And this, as I was reading interviews earlier this week, wildly surpassed organizers' dreams. Those organizers certainly being state senator or federal senator Gaylord Nelson from Wisconsin. And for good reason, there was an Earth Day in the 1970s. If you can move to the next slide, the country had faced an environmental crisis of epic proportions. This is a photo of the Cuyahoga River in Ohio that literally caught on fire repeatedly because it was so polluted. Next slide. Likewise, it was not only significant water pollution, but it was major air pollution across the country. This is a photo of dusk in Pittsburgh. And so an Earth Day was really a grassroots cry for environmental protection. And of course, ushered in the genesis or the creation of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, the state's first, or the federal government's first Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, and a raft of environmental laws at the federal level and across the states. Next slide. We, of course, in the last 50 years have made significant progress as a result of the environmental movement and the laws and policies that followed. This is a graphic that demonstrates the reduction of certain types of air pollution between 1970 and 2015. Some constituents or pollutants in the air, we've done a remarkable job of removing. Most notably a 99% reduction in lead in our air. But of course, our work continues. And if you look towards the center of the graphic, you see less than half the reduction in particulate matter, so-called PM 2.5. Next slide. Today, of course, we face a number of planetary challenges, none more pressing than climate change. This is deforestation in the Amazon. Next slide. Likewise, the impacts of climate change are upon us. These are victims of the Camp Fire in 2018. And what we know is not only is climate change threatening the overall sort of existence on our planet, but it's having real impacts here in California. Particularly in vulnerable communities and disadvantaged communities. Next slide. We also have a natural system across the planet that is in crisis. This is a mountain lion, one of the rare mountain lions in Southern California, around the Los Angeles area. Earlier this month, it was actually listed as a candidate endangered species under the California Endangered Species Act. We know across our planet, we are suffering a mass extinction crisis. And we have work to do, not only across our world, but across our country in protecting nature. Next slide. Luckily, there is a lot is happening and has happened. And I think really in the last couple of years, none more inspirational than the youth movement embodied by Greta Thunberg, where we know that we need to increase and intensify our efforts to protect the planet. And remarkable just that she, and based on her conscience and commitment, has become a global leader on this. Next slide. Likewise, there is activism happening across our communities. Greta gets a lot of press attention, but there is remarkable youth leadership and community leadership across our state and across our countries. And you'll hear from one of those youth leaders later this hour. Next slide. All sorts of good news given amidst our global challenges. This is a solar project, I think a project of Grid Alternatives, which puts solar energy into at-risk communities. This is a photo of an installation in West Oakland. Next slide. And we in California are really excited about a lot of the environmental restoration work that's happening. This is the reintroduction of North America's rarest form of trout in the Eastern Sierras last year, thanks to biologists at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Next slide. And then of course, we are a technology leader in California. This is a technician at Tesla, where electric vehicles are one of our most valuable manufacturing exports in the state. Next slide. And lastly, we are really excited and focused to be supporting community leadership to broaden access across our state so that all Californians can enjoy our environment. This is a photo that I clipped from the internet from an organization called Outdoors Outreach in San Diego. And these are young people learning how to surf. Next slide. So that's a little bit of the context of, and James, if you could take us back to our first slide with the questions, that'd be great. That's really just a sort of an overview of, from my perspective anyways, of both some of the challenges and the opportunities that we have. And so we pulled together this speaker series, which is our first speaker series that is done in this virtual format. So it's a bit of an experiment, but it's allowed us to invite 4 folks from across the state who in very different ways are advancing environmental issues today. I'll introduce them as I ask them to speak, and I'll start with Dr. Richard Joseph Jackson. Dr. Jackson is a professor emeritus at the Fielding School of Public Health at UCLA. He is now, I think, teaching in UC Berkeley, and he's actually a former California health officer for state government. Dr. Jackson, I'm going to ask you to share some perspectives on the intersection of environment and public health. You know, in 1970s, or 1970, I should say, part of the urgency around the first Earth Day was the sense that our air was polluted, our water was polluted, and therefore our health was threatened. But even 50 years on, you know, we're still struggling to make this connection between environmental protection and public health, natural spaces and public health. So I'd ask you to spend a few minutes reflecting on, one, your thoughts here on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and two, really this intersection between what we think of as environmental protection and the health of our people and communities. So welcome.
Thank you very much, Secretary Crowfoot. Can just make sure I can be heard?
You sure can.
Okay, and is my first slide, if it can be put up, the one with several of the books I've done? And the big message there is that environmental work is health work, and that the efforts to protect the environment, the efforts to protect human health are collinear. They join together like distant railroad tracks as they recede into the distance. We've got to make sure both are working. I did my pediatric training in San Francisco, and during that time, I was impressed at the number of children that were coming in from the Central Valley with clusters of birth defects. And when I finished my training, I wanted to work on farm worker health, pesticides, and other such issues, and did that for about a dozen years, and was recruited, next slide, to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta to be the lead for, this is the picture of CDC, slide 2, to be the lead for environmental health to the United States. Next slide is where I'm being sworn in to protect the people of the United States, adhere to the Constitution. But I kind of thought when I got there that all the toxicology I'd learned, and I'd learned a lot about parts per million and parts per billion and lead poisoning and air pollution, and was unprepared for some of the things I learned once I got there and had to worry about the United States and even a larger scope as well. Next slide. I was also unprepared. We'd been living in Berkeley. I was unprepared for just how difficult it was to live in Atlanta. That's where CDC is. And car crashes would completely lock up the city. And when I lived in Los Angeles, the same experience would happen all the time. But also that we continued to build and develop cities. Atlanta grew out like an inoculum on a petri dish in ways that really demanded more and more of the car culture. I was getting worn out by this. I'd been in the job, I was there 9 years. I'd been there about 3 years. And one day driving to CDC headquarters, and this is the next slide of the cars driving down Buford Highway in Atlanta, Georgia. And I realized that much of Atlanta, in fact, much of Georgia, was built without sidewalks. And the sides of that whole highway, it was called highway, but it was really a 7-lane surface street, were lined with the homes of the poor, no sidewalks, 2 miles between crosswalks, highest pedestrian death rate in the state. And that we were neglecting what was the original work in environmental health, which was to create healthy places, places that people can live and work. And it was at that point I went back and said, we need to focus a little less on parts per million and billion and think more about where people live. I'm on the slide of the picture of the home that shows typical home. And you've all seen these. We build about 3 million of them a year. And the meta message of that building, when you look at it, is what? You see 3 garage doors. We have essentially built the American family around the car. And human beings have become subordinated to the needs of automobiles. Next slide is a picture of farmland in my home state of New Jersey, where farmland, and this was superb quality farmland. This is the Garden State, if you will. And much of New York's food for about 3 months a year came from New Jersey that was trucked across to New York City. And yet the last crop, and this is true in California, and is houses, as they say. And houses, you know, the developer, the farmer can make a lot of money when you put them up, but over the long term, they're just not as productive. And it would be a lot smarter to use less land to build for people. The next slide is a picture of the California state flower. You may think it's the California poppy, but we have now poured immense amounts of concrete, and 6% of all the CO2 loading of the atmosphere is due to the cooking and curing of concrete. And we have paved over, next slide, and it shows a picture of forests being bulldozed near where I lived in Atlanta. And we have paved over the equivalent area of the entire state of Georgia with asphalt and concrete that doesn't put out oxygen when the sun shines, and when it rains, the pollution sitting on that concrete pours into the local rivers and eventually, of course, into people's drinking water. It became clear that the built environment, what we were building, was shaping our health in ways we never even realized. We became to love cars so much to fix all the things we needed to do, next slide, that we took our old schools, and many of us, at least the older ones, went to schools that looked like this, and a lot of them were within walking distance. And we basically repurposed them into old folks' homes and I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that, but elder care facilities and other businesses even. And we built, next slide, modern schools. And if you look at it, the bottom right one is where my kids went to school in Atlanta. And you have to, as you look at it, think it must have been built by folks that designed prisons, because there were no windows, and I'm not making this up, there wasn't a sidewalk anywhere around the school. In fact, there was not a sidewalk anywhere around the nation's premier health organization, the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. You were expected to drive there. And this removal of people's ability to be active, to walk, to not pollute, to not use fossil fuels, had its effects on health. Here's an immediate one that we changed. Next slide, I'm sorry. We changed how much kids did walk and bike to school. We went from 2/3 of American kids and back at Earth Day down to about 1 in 6 walking to school. Well, that removal means you're eating more, burning fossil fuels, and you're not burning fat, and you're not getting any stronger. Next slide. This was a bit after Earth Day, but this is one of the first maps that CDC did on obesity rates in the United States. And CDC gets its data from both telephone calls, but actually full-blown physical exams. I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. And you can see California looks to be, let's see, about 9% obese adults at that back in 1990. Next slide, look at this one. Here's 2016, and we have not gained weight the way the purple states and the red states, that's not a political statement, have gained. And in some of these states, Alabama, Mississippi, almost 40% of the adults now are obese. They have a body mass index that is over 30, and so many of them are morbidly obese. Well, this is not to pick on, all of us have gained weight. I'm not proud of what I've done, but I try and walk every day thanks to the dog. But look what happens, and this is the next slide, the only really technical slide in here, but it's an important one. The dark line is men, the teal colored green line is women, and as your body mass index goes up, your risk of developing diabetes goes up. So imagine that your body mass index is 30, which is just borderline obese. My risk would be almost 7 times higher of developing diabetes, but if I were a woman, it would be 27 times higher. You can see where I'm going, that changes in the environment, and a lot of this was changing in the nutrition environment and advertising environment, but some of this was removing people's physical activity from their lives. Next slide is the diabetes map from 1995. And you can see the whole country was probably under 7% of the population having diabetes. By the way, this is adult diabetes. So less than 7%, 1 in 14. But what do you think happened with this increase in body mass? Next slide. Here's 2016, the most recent map. So again, you can see Mississippi and Alabama are, they're actually up to a point where about 1 person in 6 adults has diabetes, a disease that's going to cost them their eyes, their kidneys, their feet, and their hearts. So the removal of physical activity, changing the diet, in making us all more overweight has also put us at a risk of a very serious disease that on average reduces our lifespan by about 7 years. It's very expensive as well. So I said I was a pediatrician. When I went to the pediatric children's diabetes clinic, I never saw a child with quote unquote adult onset diabetes. Next slide. And you can see the picture of the child taking his glucose, and we've gone from no children with adult onset diabetes. Now we call it type 2 diabetes, and it's as many as half the kids in the clinic. So we have 17-year-olds with diseases of 70-year-olds. So again, these changes, which people think are cosmetic, they're not. So my next few slides are maybe some of the most important and most related to resources and the other people on this call. This is, remember I said CDC, this is a 7,000 person snapshot of the US demographically based, and I won't explain the whole study, but look what happened to overall health status, same demographics 20 years ago, back 1990, versus a few years ago. Excellent health has gone down from, sorry, it's the next slide, 32% down to 13%. Increases in ability of people not being able to meet their life functions, and a doubling of the need of people for wheelchairs or canes. These folks aren't that old. They're in their 50s. They're in the prime earning years of life. Next slide. You know that smoking went down. That's great. You know, obesity went up. I just showed you that slide, but you didn't know, I didn't know, and most doctors in the country don't know this. Next slide. Very robust data. The next slide is no regular physical activity. We doctors have been wagging our fingers at people since Earth Day, saying you've got to be physically active. Look what a great job we've done. We went from no physical activity in 17% of our population to 50% of our population. This is lethal. Not being physically active, you can see this with the COVID recovery and the death rates, that being physically fit, not having diabetes, you are much more likely to survive than people that are physically inactive, and for that matter, obese. So the big takeaway from this talk that I want to offer you is anything we can do that entices people to be physically active, to get out and walk, to burn that extra sugar, to burn that extra obesity that we have on board is a good thing. So here's one thing that I worked on a lot when I was in LA and care about very much is urban river parkways. EPA, when it was started, said that every stream and river ought to be swimmable and fishable. Well, I actually think that every stream and river ought to be walkable and bikeable. And so, for example, in LA, next slide, please. I'm at the one. I'm at the one that shows the river basically looking like a sluice that Governor Schwarzenegger rode his motorcycle on in the Terminator. But the LA River was as uninviting as people. In fact, it was intended to be uninviting. It was intended also not flood the areas, but the areas around the LA River were the poorest, most physically inactive, most health challenged people in all of Los Angeles. Why couldn't this be a green space and a bicycle space, an accessible space, a way to get, if your job was up in the downtown Los Angeles, a way to get to work? The next slide is the vision of what needs to happen. And I will say the Army Corps of Engineers has stepped up, at least under the Obama administration, has been very helpful. A number of the funds coming out of the transit decisions and others have helped. A Parks Initiative has helped. But I think there ought to be a vision that every single person in California can reasonably get access to a place that they can walk and bike. And if you have a place that's pretty and green and there's nature and maybe even some natural features and birds or water birds, you don't have to wag your finger at your children. They're going to want to go out and do it. So my next to last slide is the economic benefits of these urban river parkways. And they actually, $1 spent on them generates about $3 in medical benefit and bigger economic benefit to increased value. And I know there's a danger of gentrification, but everybody would like their home to be more beautiful, more accessible, and be worth more. And so there are land benefits as well. We've got to do it in ways that do not displace people, but we also have to have a vision for making nature much more accessible to everyone, our elderly, our children, and everybody in between. And with that, I'll finish up and thank you all very much for listening. That's my last slide.
Dr. Jackson, thanks so much. Both really daunting set of data you provide in terms of the health impacts of some of these changes, but then on an uplifting front, sort of what we can be doing to reverse those. And that's a great segue to our next speaker, who is Alina Bulkday, who helps to lead planning and development at LA County Parks. Sometimes when we think about natural resources in California, we think about really remote, beautiful places. And that's, of course, part of what we're working to protect, but increasingly we're focusing on how to restore nature and open space and recreational access within the cities. Alina also serves on our state's Wildlife Conservation Board, where she helps disperse funding for environmental restoration. So Alina, what does Earth Day mean to you? And as you hear Dr. Jackson share some of the challenges we face, what is Greater LA doing to really embody environmental protection, environmental health for the next generation?
I think you're muted.
Let me unmute myself. I apologize.
You are now unmuted.
Well, let me just wish everybody a happy Earth Day, and thank you, Secretary Crowfoot, for the opportunity to share some of the thoughts about, really the important role of parks and ensuring equitable access and equitable development in our communities, particularly those communities that have been, underinvested and disinvested in over the years. So again, my name is Alina Bokde, and currently a very proud member of the Los Angeles County Department of Parks and Recreation, and also a very proud member of the State Wildlife Conservation Board. I have been a park planner and a park equity advocate for over 20 years. So this is something that is very core to who I am and care very deeply about as we look to the next 50 years and what I'm hoping the next couple of generations will be hopefully celebrating the implementation of some of the vision we're talking about today. So it's definitely not lost on me on what is going on with COVID-19 and how it is changing our world, our communities daily. And so I really believe that it is more pressing than ever that we organize together, not alone in our communities, and that we need to do this for Mother Earth and for our communities. For me, Earth Day is about galvanizing action, about moving a vision forward to create a better world, a healthy and a just world that lifts up communities. But as we lift up this vision, we must recognize and respond to the communities that have been impacted by historical disinvestment. And we cannot truly advance the cause of Earth Day without recognizing the need for environmental justice in frontline communities, communities that have been most impacted by pollution and health and park disparities. So as part of setting this vision for more equitable communities, I want to share a few examples of how parks are critical in this vision. So I will have a couple of slides here, but I did want to talk about the importance of community and what parks means in communities, particularly, again, underserved communities. So Vermont Miracle Park in South Los Angeles was opened up about 3 years ago, and the community called it a miracle park. It was the site of a former liquor store burned down in the 1992 uprising and sat vacant for over 2 decades. It is only 1/10 of an acre in the community, but it is has become and is seen as a miracle in the community. The slide that is shared in front of you now is Faith and Hope Park, which is a county park near Compton. This property in this park was located to what was known in the community as Death Alley. This site was transformed from a site of pain to healing. And so again, this park provides a safe respite for children and seniors. You can see this was the opening day for Faith and Hope Park, and the community came out in droves to really support a much needed park in the community. Again, a very powerful name of faith and hope. And then next slide. And finally, Walnut Park. This is a community, predominant immigrant community that is also organized for decades to hope beyond hope that a park would be developed. Recently, they got the wonderful news that funding is coming through a Prop 68 grant to build the first park in a community of 16,000 people in 1 square mile. So these examples of 3 communities that have struggled for years to get public investment have now made these parks a reality. And so as the names imply, a miracle, faith and hope, and putting park into Walnut Park. This is what happens when communities organize, and this is what happens when we right a wrong. We must work with communities to ensure equitable development and equitable access. I think for me, about one of the important parts about vision is to talk about data. Data tells us a story about what is happening on the ground. We need data to determine our goals, develop our vision, and track our activities to ensure that investments that are made in our parks and our environment are done in areas where they're needed the most. And again, we right or wrong. One plan that inspires and embodies this philosophy is the Los Angeles County Parks Need Assessment, which was adopted in 2016. So next slide. I just want to show how important data is in helping, again, to establish a vision. So the countywide park needs assessment, as you can see, it was an unprecedented effort to document park need countywide. And the park needs assessment is an inspiration of where we are, what we're striving for, and where we need to go. It was a community multi-jurisdictional effort, and it was the first time that we documented and established a baseline around park need to help us look to the future and set a vision. Next slide. This also shows what I believe and informs my work, that parks are public infrastructure. So for example, we know that parks help support not only capturing water, but also cleaning water. They help with cleaning air with the trees and the plants that make up parks. So as these stories that I shared exemplify, land can heal a community and provide the respite. We must work to turn the red areas that you see on these maps to green. So many of the red areas on the slide that's in front of you are those areas that we call very high or high need communities, where there is, again, kind of a disproportionate impact of not enough park acreage, very high density, and limited access to parks. So what Dr. Jackson was talking about in terms of the vision of making sure that people can walk or bike where they live, this is the vision that we need to work towards in terms of turning the red and orange areas to green. So as we look to the next 50 years, I offer some thoughts on what we need to do to create a more equitable community with parks at the core. We need to lift up the voice of community in developing the movement to take action. We must increase public funding for parks in underserved areas. And we need to do this work together and not do the work alone. We'll come out stronger. So again, recent state local investments illustrate the success by prioritizing funding for underserved and under-resourced communities. And although my work is very tied to the park needs assessment vision here in Los Angeles County, I absolutely believe that this is both impacting not only urban areas, but rural areas throughout the state and within our county. We need culture change. We need culture change that elevates urban parks and to the same level as large landscapes protections of land. That a 1 acre park in a dense community is as necessary as the important 10,000 acre forest property. Within rural communities, open space does not necessarily mean that the community has enough parks. Equitable access to parks and recreational amenities is critical to communities that are underserved. And what do I mean by culture shift? We need to change. We need to shift attitudes, behaviors, practices, and systems. We need to unlearn and what I like to call fail forward, innovate, and persist. So as we look to the next 50 years, we must support innovation and develop new tools to help implement the vision of equitable park development and access. We must have a robust programming at our parks. We must expand the definition and recognition of traditional park users. And park equity is possible, but it is only possible if we make the right decisions right now in the right places. We have a lot of work to do, and it's key when we talk about healing the earth that we must also work on transforming our brownfields to green fields. We must continue to heal the earth. So I will end with one final kind of story of a future county park that is coming, but really based on the organizing of a group called the Del Amo Action Committee, an environmental justice group. They fought almost 2 decades to bring a 9-acre park to the community where none existed. Their neighborhood was declared a Superfund site, and the community's response was to fight to clean up the air, the water, and the land. So the name of this park is Wishing Tree, and it can help us reflect that a park that the community has wished for is coming to life. And so as we look to the next 50 years, we can make wishes become reality. And it seemed fitting to end my comments with a quote from Rachel Carson. We stand now where 2 roads diverge. But unlike the roads in Robert Frost's familiar poem, they are not equally fair. The road we have long been traveling, which is the status quo, park inequity, inaccess, is deceptively easy, a smooth superhighway on which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster. The other fork of the road, the one less traveled by, offers our only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of the earth. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks and hope that the vision offers some inspiration of really what we can all do as one community. Thank you.
Thanks, Alina, so much. And I just want to recognize that a lot of groups that are joining today are really the reason why the state has made significant progress on really building in equity as a core principle for not only our environmental policy, but our natural resources policy. And it's very much of a work in progress. I'll also note we have upwards of 400 people joining us here today, my colleague tells me. So again, very excited for this level of participation. Next, we'll hear from Effie Turnbull Sanders. Effie is both a local leader and a state leader. She serves as executive director of the South LA Transit Empowerment, Commission, and also as one of Governor Newsom's appointees to the Coastal Commission. So Effie, thanks for all of your public service and welcome today. Interested in your reflections on this very peculiar but important Earth Day and what it can mean to our work together in California.
Absolutely. Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. I really appreciate the opportunity to join everyone today and really wanted to begin with just a moment just to reflect on how privileged many of us are to be able to work during this challenging time remotely from home. And really hats off to first responders and all of those folks who are on the front lines currently making sure that we get food, making sure that basic needs are met. I work as the executive director in the South LA Promise Zone, and I think my work there has definitely been influenced by many years of work in the environmental justice community and working on issues pertaining to the environment. So as I think about Earth Day and reflecting on the 50th anniversary, I think to begin, I think we have to go back to, really the inception of this focus on Earth Day, which is around justice, equity, and fairness, and making sure that we treat Earth with that same dignity and fairness. And if we look back over time, the first indignity to Earth, I think, in this continent was the genocidal acts committed against Native Americans. And so I think without recognizing the inequality that stemmed from years of forced removal, the stolen lands that occurred, and recognition and taking a moment to think about what that means for where we are now. Those injustices have continued throughout our history in California, with practices that have impacted certain communities disproportionately. You can look at negative consequences of urban renewal, where freeways were planned that were plowed through certain communities that didn't have the same kind of political voice. You look at redlining and discriminatory practices around housing and the prevention of certain communities to build wealth. And then looking really at the previous speakers and their conversations around the inequities that have occurred in the environment. So looking at the Cal Enviro screens and the impacts, the negative impacts on certain communities is particularly important to me. And I think in light of COVID-19, when so many folks, particularly in South LA, are suffering, are scraping to make ends meet during this time, thinking about how do we create a new paradigm, a new shift in the way that we treat people, in the way that we approach the environment. So I did have a few slides that may be able to be brought up on the screen. And so really looking at this issue of equity. And if you look at historic challenges over time, we have to think about what does this mean for our future, and are we willing to commit to undo these challenges into the future? If you look at our South Los Angeles area, we are an inland community. If you look at the slide to the left, in Los Angeles, that has an over 45% poverty rate. It does not have sufficient access to coast or to parks. And we're looking at challenges around the lack of green space, food deserts, access to healthy foods. And as a collective, we have about 71 nonprofit and government agency partners in a Promise Zone initiative that is a wealth building and equity initiative to bring jobs, including green jobs, to South Los Angeles, opportunities for small business development, educational opportunities, and opportunities to allow residents to live out their full human potential. So if we go to the next slide, in our Promise Zone, we are focused on revitalization, which is a focus on development that is green-centered and that is good for the environment. We're focused on equity and particularly transit access in these challenging times. If we go to the next slide, this touches on some of what was already talked about in terms of the green space disparity in South Los Angeles. Is there enough parkland for the population? No, in South Los Angeles, there's about a half an acre of parkland for every 1,000 people, and the county average is about 6 times that much. And so touching on the parks needs assessment that Alina previously mentioned, we definitely see a need to focus on more opportunities for green space. Within South Los Angeles, we are working on a project in conjunction with the State Strategic Growth Council. It's called a Transformative Climate Communities Grant. We're working along a Slauson Avenue corridor to focus on anti-displacement measures, climate justice, and bringing green space to a corridor that for far too long has not had those opportunities. And so we're really encouraged by the state's focus on climate efforts and climate justice. And we would like to advocate for more of these kinds of resources to come to South Los Angeles. If we go to the next slide, thinking again about environmental justice requiring equity. South Los Angeles, again, has been subjected to discriminatory planning and land use decisions that have impacted the health of its residents. including their vulnerability to climate change and particularly COVID-19. If you look at the CalEnviro screen and look at the particulate matter and the exposure to toxicity levels, you'll see that that has a direct correlation with respiratory disease, which then also could increase the likelihood of complications related to COVID-19. We believe that environmental equity is an investment in the resilience of these communities, and it's something that needs to occur in the years to come. South LA in particular has had challenges around civil unrest in response to government practices that have oppressed the community, police misconduct, and has never fully recovered from these challenges. And so there's an opportunity at this stage to think about how do we bring more resilience to the community in investing in green jobs and green infrastructure. If we go to the next slide. In the work with the California Coastal Commission, I think there are a lot of direct connections between South Los Angeles and communities of need and environmental justice. In my work with the Coastal Commission, we've looked at opportunities to be more inclusive, to bring more folks to the table to talk about how do we provide coastal access and resources in a more equitable way. And I think this moment is an opportunity to rethink the way that we currently do business and to think about how do we bring more people into the fold. This slide here is by a 6th grader and part of our Coastal Commission arts and poetry contest, and really is an offering of bringing the resources, the earth, the water, I think, to the people. Our Coastal Commission staff, I think, have done a great job with developing an environmental justice policy that we're continuing to build upon. The staff has also done a great job with the educational programming and thinking about how we bring that to a more diverse audience. So I think more can be done in those arenas. And I think this is also a reset moment. We've seen how the entire country has changed the way that it does its business. It's changed the way that we fundamentally operate in our relation to one another. I think this presents an opportunity for us to really have those moonshots and think about how do we want to design a society that is more green, that is earth friendly, and that is more resilient. And I wanted to leave everyone with a quote. One of my favorite authors, Octavia Butler, said, "All that you touch, you change, and all that you change changes you. And the only lasting truth is change." And I think that we have a serious and significant opportunity to do that today. And I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Effie, thanks so much. And it's a great way to end your talk and provide a segue to our last speaker, who is Jahaira Zaragoza. Jahaira is a leader of our California Conservation Corps, which is a department we're really proud of in state government that brings young women and young men into service on conservation work. Right now, today, our Conservation Corps members are fanned out across the state, staffing food banks that have seen a decline in volunteer hours as folks have had to stay at home. And our Corps members are actually packaging food to get to families who have lost their means of income and who are self-isolating. And Jahaira is a leader in her own unit in the Conservation Corps, also a senior at CSU Monterey Bay, majoring in environmental sciences with a focus on sustainability and pre-law, and really represents the best of leadership and young leadership within our state. So Jahaira, I wanted to turn it to you for sort of your perspective, your experiences, and what you've sort of seen on the ground as it relates to the environment, and what your thoughts are on Earth Day as somebody who is now, looking to spend your career working on these issues?
Yes, thank you, Secretary Wade, Crawford, and the Natural Resources Agency for hosting this discussion. And it's an honor being able to speak here today. I'd like to start off with sharing a little bit of my life story, and of course, then leading on to what I think would help this country and the world to be sustainable. I don't know exactly where this passion started for the environment. It started when I was raised in a farm. I saw my father slaughter animals, and every time I was devastated, but I knew that was essential for our household. I knew that I wanted to be part of something bigger. I knew that I needed to do something that can be drastic, that can actually change what's going on in this environment, because I realized that slaughtering animals wasn't the way. I became vegetarian because of that. And coming from a neighborhood, I live in Castro, California. It's a low income, middle class community. Being a Latina in that community, being surrounded by agriculture fields, you just feel like you are, you can't make a change. So I remember vividly when I was in high school, I joined a club. It was the SLU crew. My instructor was her ethnicity, she was white. And that was like an eye-opening for me, and a reminder that being an environmentalist in young folks, the demographic is typically white. So therefore, individuals don't want to join the movement, don't want to participate because they feel intimidated of the white demographic. I remember going out kayaking. We saw a lot of trash on shore. So the SLU crew and I, we went out and we started doing a beach cleanup, and I realized that this is what I wanted to do. I realized that I really want to give back to the community, and that I found passion of just being outdoors. I came home one day and I told my mother, I want to be an environmentalist. I want to go to school and study environmental science. And she was like, no way. She was like, you're throwing your education to the trash. There's no hope in that. You're not going to succeed. There's no money. You need to do something better with your education. You need to become a lawyer. So to me, my mother giving me the cold shoulder, it was just a reminder that because of the demographic that I come from, it's a common thing among the middle and lower class that people care and worry about other things other than helping or saving the environment. So I decided that I was gonna do this on my own. So I joined the California Conservation Corps right immediately after high school. They provide amazing scholarships, and I figured that this was the way to get the practice and also get the experience, or yes, that goes hand in hand with what I'm learning. While in the Corps, I first joined and I brought my practices of recycling, doing like little minor things. I took that on to camp support. And here on center, I became the recycling coordinator. And I realized that, yes, I could be part of something bigger. So being in the Corps, that influenced me in the way that I perceive things. Next slide, please. I was exposed to fuel reduction. I was exposed to removal of invasive species. I was exposed to trail maintenance. Next slide, please. And I realized that these are all great fundamental ways to serve the environment, but it's not helping the environment. Next slide, please. So I decided that we need to find a better way to help the environment. So on one occasion, this actually happened about a month and a half ago, I dropped a 150-foot redwood tree. I was devastated, but I knew it had to get done to provide better health for the environment, for the forest. But I realized that I just cut down a tree, which provides us oxygen, which provides us food, holds our water. It's just a fundamental, it's an essential for our life. Life on Earth. So I was driving home one day, and this actually just happened like 3 weeks ago. I went home. I actually decided when I was on my way home, I decided to stop and buy 2 redwood saplings. I hiked out to one of the spots that is truly caring, or that I truly care about, which is in Felton. That's where my passion for the CCC all started. It was on a spike. It was a camping project for 8 days. I planted one there, and I planted one on Highway 1 in Moss Landing. I drive by there every day, and I wanted that to be a symbol that every day I pass by there, I'm able to see the growth that I contributed to something bigger. So that leads me on to, I now have about 12 successful tree saplings that I've planted. And I will continue to do that because I believe that that is fundamental. Next slide, please. Small impacts that I do to help is at home, I have a garden. I try to regrow from kitchen scraps. I take quick showers. I do not order things online because they use excessive plastic. I believe that it's absurd. Let's see. And so that leads me on to my main point of this conversation, which is, next slide, please. Ways that we can be of help for our communities, and that is sustainability. We need better ways to sustain the amount of population that we have on this earth. 2 ways that I think of from my personal experience is educating. We need to educate young females as they are essential to households. They are our future generations. We need to educate them, give them the resources. That will help decrease population. It will give them a distraction and will not want them to go into bad habits, which often lead in pregnancy, unfortunately. We need to educate our females. They will pass down their resources and their practice to children, and that will just carry on for generations. Another essential point that we need to do to maintain sustainability is provide open and green spaces for our children, for our families. A great way is either going out planting trees or building a garden. Building a garden is essential. It provides produce for the family. It saves money. It gives them practical skills. It gives them, it helps them develop their relationships with their neighbors, with their families. And most of all, it helps them develop their mental health. It gives them sanity. It's just a great way for them to be raised around a natural environment. Therefore, I really urge the community to help educate our young females as they are our future. And I really urge for families to start planting gardens, whether that's just in your kitchen or outside in a raised bed. Overall, my message is, in order to decrease population and become more sustainable with what we have, we need to start by educating and giving back to our young children, and especially those poor communities in which I come from, where I thought that I couldn't be able to make a change because of the weight that I had from my community. With that, I would like to end and thank you, Secretary, for this honor.
Jahaira, thanks so much. And you're a great final speaker with your inspiration and your focus for the future. So thank you for your leadership and all that you do. We want to move just quickly, if we could, to just a very short round robin. As I explained at the top of this discussion, this online format is really very much of an experiment. And it's clear we could spend a lot more time all together having a group discussion. I want to respect time and those participants who are joining the other commitments that you have today. So we'll end with one round robin question, and then I'll maybe bring it home. My round robin question for the group, and I think we're going to move to sort of a Brady Bunch screen as we have this group conversation for each panelist, is what is one thing that you wish for will happen in California in the next 10 years on the way to Earth Day 60? So in a sentence or two, starting with Dr. Jackson, one thing that you wish for changing or improving in California in the next decade.
honestly, everybody's got to get out and vote. And what we have learned is that poor leadership is a disaster. And I say it, the converse of that is, I think the state leadership has been really excellent. And I watch the national stuff all the time. I want to thank you all for that.
Thank you so much, Richard. Let's move to Alina. One wish for the next decade in California.
My wish is that we continue to work towards creating more equitable communities and putting equity first, putting equity at the center of our decisions and policies and goals and vision. So my wish for the next 10 years is that equity is at the center of our decision making.
Great, and to build a whole lot more of those incredible parks in underserved communities in LA, no doubt.
Absolutely.
Effie, one wish for California, given this, as we move to Earth Day 60 in 10 years.
One wish would be that everyone fills out their census and that everybody is counted and that we can get the resources that we need to the communities that need it most and that we focus on equity. I would love to see disadvantaged communities participating in wealth building opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities, green jobs, and be fully integrated into a future of green economy.
Excellent, Effie. Oh, thank you. That's an excellent reminder. Jahaira, as you get ready to finish university and move on, what do you want to see in California over the next 10 years? One wish.
Yeah, one wish, I wish to see minorities and the youth out there being involved in environmental movements and have population, decrease a little. Have females stop having so many kids. Focus on your education, focus on the environment, and try to give back.
Thanks so much. Well, it's clear that when you have a milestone like Earth Day, you could take on so many topics in a discussion like this, and I'm really glad that we brought leaders who are really driving the discussion on public health and equity. That's obviously a huge priority of Governor Newsom and the administration, and I think our four panelists did a really good job providing their own perspectives on what Earth Day means to them. So thanks so much for participating. I hope you found it interesting. We hold a Secretary Speaker series at Natural Resources about once a month. We do it in person in Sacramento, but we do live stream it and it gets recorded on the internet. So I hope you'll be able to join us in the future. Big thanks to my colleagues, Lizzie and Angela and Mark for helping spearhead this discussion. And please go out there, make it a great Earth Day and stay safe and healthy. Thank you so much. Take care.